We are so delighted that he is joining us today to speak to us about gender justice and how we can reimagine language education through trans knowledges. Please help me welcome Dr. Kris Knisely.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Erica. And thank you all for having me. It's an honor and it's a pleasure. Um, you'll see that link on the first slide here. I'm hoping that giving you a copy of all of the materials that I'm using today and a number of additional resources will allow more of us to be part of this conversation and all of us to be more present in this work. I'll leave those materials up. You can share that link. You can keep that link, do it with it what you will. Because that's really always the question for me. What can we do in an hour to fuel this collective work towards gender justice? How can we start this process of standing in the tensions of our own humanity, our own languaging and gendering, and look through all of that for what might be our greater potentiality? How do we start to think about what we can do to work towards a world where language enriches the livability of all of our lives? That's a huge task, right? In general, because liberation and justice is work that's always ongoing, and even more so in the current cultural and political moment in which I'm joining you, one where words and with them concepts and people are being deleted from databases, ones where trans people are experiencing genocide. And as I wrote in my most recent chapter, which now feels like a bit of an understatement, it's a world where the very notion of a pronoun or other gender-inflected language forms end up getting made into transphobic rallying cries. This cissexism might be accelerating and taking new pathways, but it isn't new, and neither is trying to hide isms behind language attitudes, nor is the imperative for us to counter them. As I wrote in 2023, which I feel like I could have written yesterday, the impetus for trans inclusion in language classrooms and research has been amply articulated. The time has long since been here for us to work towards forms of gender justice that honor and revel in the knowledges and lingual cultures of trans people. Despite this clear imperative, many of our language students report uneven, if not entirely absent, engagement with trans ways of being, knowing, and languaging. Our fields, which so often claim to foster global and intercultural connections, to promote the development of critical literacies, and to do diversity, equity, and inclusion or social justice work, whether these or by any other names, appear to have little insulation from the onslaught of transphobic violence that plagues our broader sociocultural context in simultaneously globalized and localized ways. Rather than collectively and consistently upending the transphobia and exclusionary practices that are entwined with our institutions, the processes and products of language education too often serve to reproduce and reformulate cisheteronormativities. And as we cling fast to normative ideas about language, and with these ideas about being and belonging, we distort the very nature of what language is and of what we do when we language together. It's long since time not only that we include trans people in our practices and materials, but that we rethink the core of what we're really doing when we're teaching and learning to language with translingual cultures and knowledges in mind. Gender justice is about more than inclusion alone. We're not just bringing trans people into systems that are harmful and cisnormative, because when we're focused on inclusion alone, it's easy for trans multilingualisms to remain absent, and for cislingualism, that is, the valuing of cisnormative lingua cultures and these restrictive ideologies that inflect them, those often stay and tacitly drive classroom and professional languaging cultures, even ones that do include so-called inclusive languaging. So, do we want to include trans people in language and education? Yes, but not by trying to make trans people fit into wildly cisnormative cultures of language and learning. Building on Milani and Cashman's thinking about queering multilingualism as involving much more than the study of language practices of queer multilingual individuals and communities, but also including the unsettling of established ideas about visibility, recognition, teaching methods, and language learning through queer knowledges and lingua cultures. Movement towards an applied translinguistics, towards a gender-just language education, and towards trans multilingualisms is about a lot more than just studying translanguagers alone. It's about unsettling ideas of the social and relational acts of doing in language and gender and doing them together, which means unsettling ideas about visibility and invisibility and how we value those. In language knowability, who can be known in language and how? Linguistic authority, individual agency, and the ways that fuller linguacultural participation is taught and learned. This through trans knowledges and lingua cultures. That is, through trans cultures of language and the ways that trans cultures are in language. And always, this is always done in concert with other justice-oriented approaches and all other aspects of being and belonging. The stakes of this work are high because they are human. They're about who is and who is not here in our classrooms, in our degree programs, and frankly, not only. It's no exaggeration to say that our work can be life-giving, life-sustaining, world-growing. It can be enriching and expansive, or it can continue to ensmall and harm people. Gender-just language pedagogies have to be about critically resisting anti-trans forces. But they also have to be something more than a response to oppression alone. Lest we continue to limit trans ways of being, knowing, and languaging to the cis-slated distortions and oversimplifications that always having to make trans life readable to cis audiences and understandable through cis frames produces. And it looks like my formatting is slightly off, so you're not seeing the very top of my slides. Well, unless I hit OK. Just kidding, you are. Let me hit OK so you can see that. So that's cislation up there. I really like what Z. Nicolazzo writes about trans people. And she writes, we may be from oppression, but are not solely constituted of oppression. And I think we can draw parallels to what we think about when we think about gender-just language and pedagogies. This is something that we can talk more about during discussion if you want. I'll hopefully leave lots of time. This idea is really that if we engage with trans people without steeping that engagement in trans knowledges and lingua cultures, we end up hyper-focusing only on what makes trans ways of being, knowing, and languaging understandable to cis people. And often that leads us to maintain cisnormativity, changing perhaps some of our behaviors on the surface level, but still thinking cis, still doing all of this on cis terms and through cis logics, right? So one example is we end up hyper-focusing on sharing names and pronouns and doing it in a way that prioritizes cis comfort and understanding over more community-based approaches. Our naming practice is important, yes, but we have to think about them within this broader frame. As Aric and Russell and I wrote about in Redoing Linguistic Worlds, we're joining a call. We're coming together to bring forward ways of doing language, linguistics, and education that are broadly more expansive, led by people who are in community. And as Coda, Moore, Marie, Spiegelman, Vandrick, and I argued at AAAL in 2023, one where community epistemologies are taken up by all of us, not siloed and not made secondary to cis comfort. This has to be community-centered, ethical, coalitional, and capacity building work. We have to do better for each other and with each other, because as Kosnick wrote, the world needs gender-just languagers. And there's no better place than the language classroom to assemble, engage, and actualize gender just practices together. In language education, we often see this occur through engagement with trans-affirming queer inquiry-based pedagogies or through related forms of gender just pedagogies. Often because praxis gives us very tangible examples of what it means to unsettle cis-heteronormativities in our field and to unsettle normativity in all of its forms. And also because it makes concrete how engagement with translingual cultural logics both invite and require a rethinking of what language education entails. How this engagement opens up new pathways as we reckon with long-standing tensions in our field and around the role of our field in society, arguably. I want to be clear, I think of critical social justice, anti-oppressive, anti-racist, and other such liberatory pedagogies as all moving in the same direction, each with different foci, community knowledges, and the like. But if we're really doing the work of engaging with each other as whole persons, we can't ever fully disentangle one aspect of being and belonging from others. In the interest of time, I'm going to do the quickest version of TAQIBPs that I can, and I'll point you outwards to the infographics that are on my website and the article that I co-authored with Josh Paez, where we originally described these. But the core aims of gender justice are to unearth and question all forms of normativity. Yes, as they relate to gender and sexuality, but not only. It's also about raising awareness of the lives, experiences, and lingua cultures of queer and trans people, particularly locally relevant lingua cultures. It's also about actively creating and maintaining space for marginalized people and perspectives, keenly attending to the respecting individual agency and the right to self-definition, focusing on fostering respectful engagement with disparate worldviews, and always leaving room for fluidity, flexibility, and complexity. It wouldn't be very queer of me to tell you that there's only one way to do this, right? There's just limitless ways that work in particular contexts with particular groups of people, but some really common themes in how this gets carried out involve exploring with and alongside students in an effort to individualize learning, decenter the classroom, and really trouble ideas about expertise that students bring with them, really troubling power dynamics and inviting students to question those with us. It also involves finding space throughout the curriculum. This isn't some sensationalized queer and trans day or queer and trans class or the professor who takes up queer and trans things, right? It's about desensationalizing and creating value around queer and trans knowledges as part of broader critical literacy. And with that, it involves engaging critical, close reading and discussion, right? We want to invite our students to be asking questions about how language, assumptions, and normativity shape our perceptions of reality and constrain certain forms of being. And we're also engaging students in the relationship between what we might call queer and trans content with learning goals so that they understand that gender and sexuality are important parts of languaging and being in the world. We're trying to undo what Moore, Coda, Spiegelman, and Kahneman-Taylor describe as students understanding their classrooms as spaces of compulsory cis heteronormativity. And we're trying to teach students the kinds of critical habits of mind, these kinds of ongoing restive problematizing that allow them to observe, call out, and question normativity in all of its forms. We want to help them consistently be asking, what is the status quo? Why is it the way that it is? Who benefits? Who's marginalized? How is it maintained? And what alternatives exist? We're teaching them to analyze language and culture as dynamic as ongoing social acts that are always open to modification and change. And we're working to teach them to think about the whole of the world around them with trans epistemologies, not just about trans people through cis frames. So if I slide this over and I bring back my starting list of what we're trying to unsettle in unscripting cislingualism, we can start to see how we begin to operationalize this unsettling with our students. What we're doing with gender just pedagogies, these relational pedagogies of care, is teaching students to think with trans ways of knowing and being. We're trying to help them develop their trans multilingualism. And really central to translingual cultures is understanding language as the social, relational, embodied act, not things. What do I mean by this? When we let go of the expectation that most everyone is or should be cisnormativity, and the prejudices and discrimination that this often entails, cissexism, we're opening ourselves up to an infinite galaxy of possibilities for doing gender beyond what cisnormative imagination can contain. We're underscoring gender as something that's fundamentally social and relational, something that's interactionally and collaboratively realized in myriad ways across time and linguocultural contexts. These infinite possibilities for gender, they exist in the ways that we group and continuously regroup commonalities and roles, practices, and identities, in the ongoing renegotiation of the legible categories in which we filter those groupings, and in the ways that people actively position themselves within or against the social groupings they're aware of. That's what we're doing when we're doing gender. We're doing this social dance. I'm aware of these categories. I'm going to sort of caucus with these and attempt to get my gender read. And this infiniteness involves the concept of gender modality. Gender modality is ways of being one's gender, such as trans, cis, or many other novi modalities that don't fit a trans-cis dichotomy. This understanding of gender not as a thing that exists before us or without us, as something that's done collaboratively and continuously made and remade in interaction, resonates with really important ways with why you'll hear me use terms like languaging and languagers. And that's because language isn't primarily a thing. It can't possess particular forms of quality or qualities. It isn't capable of doing or not doing a particular function, but it's a relational process, something that's dependent upon and emerges within interaction between humans. It's this multimodal, whole-bodied action through which our worlds are continuously created and recreated. Language is a verb, engaged in by languagers, unrestricted to the oral modality of speakers or the stakeless passivity of users. Languaging is a purposeful, intuitive act, and in languaging is the pattern outcome of these communicative processes. It's about making something real by languaging it, rendering real by rendering linguistic. I'm definitely not the only one to argue for modality neutral languaging, and I strongly recommend John Henner's work if you haven't read it. But I'm building on this ongoing conversation in my work because these understandings of language and gender as concomitantly embodied social and relational acts form a critical foundation for working with trans knowledges. They're tied up with how we do language and gender and how we do them together. If we language, it's because we're part of social languaging collectives, the ones through which we learned and continually relearn to do language, and those that we join along the way, right? It might seem like a very banal statement to talk about language as a verb, but it's a critical assertion because really often, and usually reflexively and not reflectively, we'll say that a language or another has some form or quality. It does or doesn't do some function, and it is or is not in taxonomic relation to others, according to one or more forms, qualities, or functions, right? You hear people say things like, French has two genders. That's a real perversion of the humanistic nature of language. It works really well in shorthand. I catch myself doing it all of the time too, but it renders opaque what's really happening in linguistic life. People who do languagers aren't simply passive users of some pre-established inherited system that gets foisted upon them, but they're agentive participants, right? They are constantly remaking, recreating in language reality, challenging antecedent enlanguagements by transgressing so-called rules of languaging and languaging new ideas and realities. People are opening up new ideational worlds, and they're prefiguring and enacting more possibilities. This is what's at the core of translingual cultural life. Languagers proposing innovative forms, deploying novel structures, and challenging these antecedent prescriptions and patterns aren't challenging just prior enlanguagements or just adding to existing systems. They're remaking these worlds of language, their own, of course, but also everyone else's. And so, as we're trying to guide languaging collectives through which our students learn and continually relearn to do language, we have to bring this intentional resistance to cislingual prescriptivism and engage in remaking linguistic worlds that allow their fuller expression and enlanguagement. As we look at research that's coming out in applied linguistics, we're not only having these ways of thinking differently about languages, social verb, and agentive participation, we're also concretely seeing how this shifts students' relationship to language, language learning, and the people with whom they're doing these acts. It's introducing the possibility of trans prefigurative politics into our educational landscape. So we know from research that including trans knowledges and linguistic practices via gender-just language pedagogies responds to ethical imperatives of inclusion. And I should be able to stop the talk there. Great, we're all going to go off and do it. But we also see through research that gender-just pedagogies do a lot more than that. They're also a foundation for critical contemporary literacy, which includes this ability to flexibly, fluidly, and intersectionally discuss gender and all other aspects of being and belonging. So we get this more accurate and robust understanding of language as a complex adaptive system. And with that, we have the chance to contend with the ways that inherent variation and change necessarily produce rich and complex relations among multiple linguistic co-cultures. And we get to think differently about what it is we're doing in learning to language. We're learning new relational acts, right? And in thinking about this, we're troubling a lot of preconceived notions in our field, one of which is competence, right? We see competence being troubled in Trans of Color critique and work by Jonathan Rosa, or Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, Ujuanya, and others. And we're sort of doing a similar dance in trans studies, where if we play within the colonial, ableist, cislingual, and otherwise normativizing concept of competence, research tells us that students who learn about trans knowledges and linguistic practices make significantly fewer grammatical and lexical errors as compared to those who don't, without any difference in the complexity of the language that they produce. And that gender-just pedagogies even positively contribute to student success with notoriously challenging forms and structures. But teaching in these ways also equips students to question what their goal is, right? And question competence and native speaker models and their own agency in choosing when to challenge these frames. Um, so we've talked about it's ethical, it's inclusive, it's helping us with contemporary literacy, understanding language better. If we play within linguistic competence, we end up with clearer forms there. And we also end up seeing markedly more evidence of intercultural competence development and symbolic competence development. So having that desire and ability to engage with people whose realities may be different from their own, and then understanding that all of this is imbricated with power and being able to assess and participate in the power game, thinking about when they might want to challenge it. Another key benefit of gender just pedagogies that we see is the development of the skills, knowledges, and attitudinal stances that align with intersectional thinking. For example, in my study published in Contemporary French Civilization, students who learned about gender justice were more than 17 times more likely to demonstrate intersectional awareness than those who didn't. And there's a lot of positive with gender just pedagogies in these three areas because we know that these are traditionally very difficult things for us to teach and break into, especially at earlier levels of languaging. So if we take this whole picture, what we see is that when we allow for complexity in how gender is taken up in and through language, we're not placing ethics and inclusion in competition with more traditional student outcomes, but rather in service of them. And we get a chance to really question what are our goals in language education and how might taking on being and belonging in new ways fuel that rethinking. Part of this, sure, involves modeling additional forms, structures, patterns, and strategies. But in gender just pedagogies, languaging and learning are not about these. We're not taking binary forms and making them gender just by expanding them into trinaries because three options, even if they make linguocultural lives more livable for some, are still maintaining the power to oppress and marginalize. Instead, we're trying to unscript the cisnormative logic that there is a right form, a way to do language, a right way to be in the world. Gender just languaging isn't about finding an ideal set of forms or even expanding taxonomies. It's about undoing a cislingualist relationship to language, to gender, and to their entanglements that suggest any rigid limitation on how people can do these and do them together. A lot of times we want for a direct and transparent relationship between language and gender, or one acceptable set of forms and structures, or even finite possibilities, right? In language education, it's really easy to say, well, then tell me what to do. What should I teach, right? I have to make those very concrete choices. But all of that is a really cislingualist compulsion that's misunderstanding the interplay between language and gender and is distorting translingual cultures. Trans people are far more creative, and translingual culture is far more robust than to be limited to any one form or strategy alone. In and across cultures, translingual cultures are lingual cultures of variation, not only recognizing but requiring a plurality of possibilities for the forms that languaging can take. This requirement is a part of the respect for individual agency and a right to self-definition that characterizes translingual cultures and the manifold positionalities that are taken up by the people from which these cultures stem. After all, something that I think is really important is understanding that trans is a largely incoherent category. It groups together people with really wide-ranging experiences of gender and its modalities. And so when trans people are doing language, we're not only defining binaries inscribed in particular languaging varieties, but the borders of canonically named languages. Trans people actively draw on their full linguistic repertoires and find inspiration in translingual cultures the world over, regardless of how they might defy others' ideas about tidy, appropriate, or expected ways of languaging. This occurs no doubt in part due to rich online social networks that connect trans people from across the world, and due to the relationship that many trans people have to language play and innovation, wherein one of my participants who I really like said, we're all kind of linguists, basically by necessity. Um, and so I'll keep this short in the interest of time and having discussion because that's where things will get interesting, I think. But you see some contexts where translanguaging is marked by what we might consider lexical borrowings, right? We see English they or a phonetically adapted version of that show up in personal pronoun options in some Russian and German translingual cultures. But then we also see the borrowing of Swedish hen and Norwegian by German, Norwegian, and Danish people. Z ends up showing up in English, Norwegian, and Swedish. And we also see mix crossing over at least English and French. I'm sure there are many other languages using that too. And so we might think, oh yeah, trans people encounter words from other languages, borrow them in, adapt them phonetically, great. But translanguaging isn't just about borrowing across neatly defined languages, right? It's also about questioning the tidiness of these distinctions and thinking languages together. And so we end up with noticing all of these different ways that we can in language social positioning. I'll skip them in the interest of time. And we start thinking about how can we borrow ideas? Well, punctuation shows up in several languages to try to make new possibilities, particularly in written communication. But so does indirect non-binary languaging or this gender avoidant languaging, where we use canonical ways of languaging to work around um, misgendering people, but not necessarily having noticeably non-binary forms, which that sort of more of noticeable forms is direct non-binary languaging, where we see innovative forms, structures, the reworking of sentence structure and other strategies across various languages. But the the biggest thing I think to take away from translingual cultures and gender-just pedagogies is that what we need to come away and do and is ask questions about what we're teaching, what our classrooms are sites for, and what our roles are as scholars and educators. What I mean by this is, are we teaching others to understand languages rigidly prescribed, always distinct, and relatively fossilized things to be protected and rotely reproduced within a hegemonic order? Or are we teaching people to recognize that languaging is an action that involves their agentive participation, even as students, right? In these porous yet connected languaging communities. Are we teaching people that there's one right way to do language? Or are we teaching them that there are infinite ways to language together and that ways of languaging are always shifting and evolving to meet our relational and communicative needs? And that meaning is created in and through the language exchanges that we have with others. Are we focusing on forms and structures for their sake alone? Or is our work a core site for languaging, which includes form and structure, but whose thrust is not centrally about these alone? Are we acting as agents of so-called linguistic authorities, teaching linguistic hegemonies to a new generation? Or are we acting as experienced co-languagers, guiding those with less experience through their own agentive relationship to doing language with others? Are people learning from us to police and judge others' language against an idealized and necessarily cis-heteronormative native speaker model? Or are they there to form connections with one another and with people from across the world, recognizing the value of wide-ranging linguistic co-cultures as that they'll necessarily experience as a part of those relationships? In short, translingual cultures invite us to ask questions not only about what our and others' goals are in teaching and learning new ways of languaging, but also about what it is that we're really teaching when we're teaching and researching language, when we're teaching and researching in and through language. Trans people offer us a clear reminder that languaging is about inviting each other into understanding our realities, about figuring out together how to make meaning, about sharing the worlds that already exist, and about prefiguring the worlds that we want to bring into being. Translingual cultures invite us to think otherwise, to reimagine what we do as scholar educators, whether we're in fields like language and linguistics, or we're scholar educators, and or people who are otherwise bound up with the social and relational act of doing language. They invite us to act for change, to ask, what will we do as individuals, scholars, students, and educators to work towards a world where language is enriching the livability of all of our lives, not constraining them? And so with that, I'm going to cut myself off, say thank you, remind you one more time that you have the slides and all sorts of other documents at that link, and just open it up for questions and conversation about where we go from here, what's on your mind, what stood out to you, where did I fail to make meaning, etc. Thank you.
Wonderful. Kris, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I think you have given us a lot of very important information, lots of good pointers, lots of bits and pieces of where we can follow up on and do better. So at this point, we would like to open it up for questions, and we do have to use the microphone so that Kris can actually hear us.
Hi, I'm Marie Roberts. I'm a openly trans freshman here at Cornell. And one question that I have for you as somebody who is just getting started here is, where would you recommend finding research opportunities, especially as a lot of them are foreclosing, in terms of like trans topics and trying to educate people on an individual level about understanding of trans people and gender at a broader level, in terms of like many people who have just been so wrapped up in conservative disinformation about all of these things, especially with how the Trump campaign recently spent a lot of their money focusing on very anti-trans advertising and just trying to get people to understand how this affects everything about gender from a broader level, and how creating this understanding from a more queer perspective in general doesn't just help trans people, it helps everyone. Where would you recommend, basically, where would you recommend looking for that research? And where would you recommend starting off on like finding it, building those coalitions, or looking for those coalitions within local communities and areas such as a college campus?
An awesome question, an important question, and one that gets at, well, you heard me say a few times, coalition building, coalition building. Um, we know as faculty who have been here for some time that the number of people who are prepared to advise students in these areas and have expertise in these areas is a lot smaller than the students who are up and coming researchers who want to do this work. And so part of like my whole focus now that I got tenure a little bit is, how do I do exactly the kind of thing that you're asking for? How do I make room for people who want to do this work to have support in it. So the first thing I'm going to say is email me. And let's talk about the very specifics of what you're interested in and what you want to do, and let me see who I can get you connected with. The broader thing that I'll say is sort of a two-parter. The Center for Applied Trans Studies is a good place to look for trans-led research generally. And that group takes a very post-disciplinary sort of approach to things. Another group that I'd tell you to get linked in with is Lavender Languages and Linguistics. They do a conference that undergrads, grad students, everyone is totally welcomed at. Like, the big point of that one is a no attitudes conference, whether you're getting started or whether you're about to retire, it's a place for you if you're doing queer and trans language research. So they do the conference, and then they do a summer institute online where you can take classes with faculty who are specialized in trans language and linguistics. And then that's sort of like my two big organizations. Then the email me note. And the other thing I'll say is I've had a lot of colleagues internationally asking me, what can we do as life is getting pretty dire for trans academics in the US? And some of the things that I've been telling them is, if you can create a fellowship to get a trans person out, to give them a semester, a year to figure out what they need to do or see how things are going to go, that's a good one. And I throw this less out for you in your role as starting in this area, and more for my colleagues in the audience who may have connections and want to answer that question. And then the other thing is a lot more emphasis on international publishing. I've had trans colleagues in Spain asking me, like, all right, I'm the head of this conference and this journal. Like, how do we create possibilities for you all as US academics who are going to need places to publish this as things are happening? So, you know, Tommaso Milani brought back the activist phrase, queer as in fuck you. And I think that's kind of the energy that we have to have doing this research, right? We're here, we're going to do it. You want to tell me that I can't publish here, or you're not going to give me money for it? Well, I guess it's not the first time, and we'll find a way, right? I always tell my students, language finds a way when they're worried about like what's going to happen. We can't plan for it. Language finds a way. And I think that's kind of what we have to do with this research too. We're going to find a way. So that was a bit rambly as well, but I'm glad you're here. Let's do the research. Let's get to know each other so that I can maybe give you some more people to know who are really closely aligned with what you want to do.
And you are getting the thumbs up, which you can't quite see with our camera. Our camera setup is not ideal.
It happens.
That-
It is a
that
bit
was-
odd looking at the backs of your heads, but
All of that was wonderful. That was great advice. Thank you. I will most definitely reach out.
awesome.
Other questions for Kris? Comments, thoughts? Anyone from the online audience? Wonderful. Oh, nope. Luke has a question.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I'll forego the rambling of someone who administers a Department of Education grant and ask you how you approach evaluation of students in the classroom from this perspective. I think it's something that I think reasonably trips up a lot of people. A student's pronouns can change across the semester. When you're dealing with a language like Spanish, for instance, a student might mimic the pronouns that an instructor is using, and those pronouns may or may not match the students. So how do you approach in written evaluation, in speaking evaluation, guiding students through this methodology that you've laid out. And thank you again for a great presentation.
Thank you, Luke. As someone who is currently on sabbatical in order to do a Department of Ed funded grant on trans pedagogies and translinguistics, I will just forego the ramble of solidarity and say, I'm so sorry we're here. And get to your question about evaluation, which is easier for me to answer. So I think for me, the big thing that I keep in my mind when talking about evaluation is curiosity over correction. And that is when I read something that doesn't quite line up to my expectations for what someone would be communicating, I explain how I'm understanding what they wrote and offering what might be likely possibilities for what they might have meant to say. So instead of seeing, for example, a student who says, I'm going to give an awkward English example in the interest of everyone following. If I see a student who writes, he is pretty, instead of writing, your pronoun and your adjective don't match, I would write, often, is this what you meant? To me, that reads as he might be queer, or maybe you're insulting him. We would tend to see he is handsome or she is pretty. Let's talk about what's happening with gender here if you didn't mean what you wrote, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity to say, whoa, what you wrote, like, it surprises me. Instead of being like, that's wrong, fix gender, just going, oh, this really draws my attention. Did you mean how I'm trying to read this? And I think the other thing is, at least in teaching French, I think there ends up being a lot of overemphasis on quote unquote gender agreements or noun class agreements, particularly early on, when we know that that's something that students start to get a handle on much later. And I'm not saying abandon it, never tell them that it's not le table, it's la table, but have them reflect with you about where it matters and where it doesn't, and why it might matter. And that starts to get into this focus on power dynamics, right? And we can talk with students about, well, you might encounter someone who insists that they have no idea what you're talking about when you attribute a noun to the wrong class. I'm not sure I believe it, but what will it do for sure, right? It will mark you as someone who maybe hasn't been languaging in French that long, or hasn't done it their whole life. Does it matter? Why might that matter? In what context does that matter? Do you care about it? Do you want to try to correct it? And I sort of try to blend how I think about gender and language from a trans knowledge's perspective with people who are doing work like in ungrading, and people who are writing about student motivation as a lot more holistic, a lot less, I want to perfectly produce utterances. What do you really want to do here? And is focusing on this helping you? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe not for you, and maybe for the person sitting next to you. So I think a lot more sort of dialogic relationship where we go, what are the effects? Because when we have that conversation, so I put out that piece that shows that students make massively fewer errors and do better on more complex structures when we teach through gender justice and make them aware of translingual cultural practices. But why? Because we've had the conversations with them for them to realize the relationship between form and meaning, for them to care about certain structures because they realize how it's coming off. And so I sort of try to approach evaluation and assessment from that sort of growth conversation relationship. Why do you care? Instead of wrong, fix it, right? Because the more we have a relationship with our students and the more they care about what's considered an error and why and who gets to decide that, the more invested they are in manipulating form to do relationships, to do meaning making. So that's sort of my general perspective. I don't know if it helps or if you wish to keep going on that conversation, but those are my thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We might have time for one final question or comment if there is anything. I don't think we have anything in Zoom land. Okay, Pelin.
Hi, I'm Pelin, and my native language is Turkish, which is one of the probably the best gender neutral and gender just language ever there. The reason why it was built on that is to create and is to foster that gender equality and diversity. However, in time, I don't know what happens over time. The imposition of patriarchy is so strong that the language should shape the culture, but it's just the culture is like so patriarchal, so non-inclusive that the language is it's barren now in terms of including diversity and equity and all these things. So what would you suggest in these circumstances? How are we going to change the culture if we can't do that through language? Because it seems like it's not working so well in my culture. Because the language is perfectly shaped. We have only one pronoun. That's great, right? But the culture is not. So what would you say? What would you suggest that to create more equivalency and create more diversity so that we can embody all genders. Thank you. And your talk was great, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked that question because Turkish may be one of the best examples to really hit home the point about form isn't everything, right? Changing surface structures without changing thinking just gives us different ways to do gender related harm, right? And so I think part of this is the task in Turkish is not necessarily saying, here are non-binary forms and structures, here's non-binary languaging, but the task in Turkish is to say, here are non-binary people who language in Turkish. Here are trans people who language in Turkish, and explore the cultures that exist. And it's probably going to be challenging. And that's part of the conversation too. A lot of times people want to say, how do I go about doing this where it's not in my textbooks and the cultures I'm teaching about are relatively trans antagonistic. And I like to remind people that you are not going to shock a trans person in the entire world by telling them that a particular place, a particular group of people is transphobic and cissexist. And like, that's kind of just baseline trans existence in the world, is to experience different forms of antagonism. And so I think a lot of what I find useful in this concept of co-culture is that you can have the conversation that like maybe the average person in Turkey is going to have no concept of non-binary, no concept of trans, or maybe they will, I don't know. But like there's sort of this idea of general discourse that is happening among cis people. But then because those people aren't aware of it does not mean that it doesn't exist, because it doesn't show up in our mass market materials that have to be sellable in places like Florida and across the world, right? Because we have to do certain things to make them whatever people decide they need to make them. I won't go on that tangent. Doesn't mean that there isn't something there. And so I think there's something to be said about looking through what might be there, what might be still sort of underground in some regards, is something to be said. And then, so Turkish is maybe challenging in that we can't point to certain forms and structures and say, see, this is how it happens here. But we're definitely still doing gender in language, right? We're not doing it in noun class, and we're not doing it in pronouns, but I don't know the details, but I'm sure that it shows up in some way, right? That their language is still a key resource in doing gender. And so that might be a bit of sociopragmatics to look at with students and say, okay, maybe it's really important to you that you really do masculinity, really do femininity, really do non-binarity, really make sure that people understand XYZ about you or someone you're languaging about. Well, how might that be accomplished in language, right? How might that be showing up? Is it intonation? Is it cadence? Is it certain nouns, verbs, etc., that tend to get used more? And not in a sort of like one-to-one, right? It's not, I am woman, therefore I language this way. But it is, we read language and then we perceive that person as sort of caucusing with women. Maybe they're a woman, maybe they're not a woman, not entirely sure, right? That's kind of how gender works. We just sort of guess about it until maybe it gets addressed or maybe it doesn't. And so teaching students that like all of these little things go into language, and some of those they might be able to do at a certain point, just like everything else they do with language, it sort of builds, right? But I think that in the classroom, I'd be pointing this out to them, right? Pointing out that really it should be easy and home and lots of space for people doing lots of genders, but that's not always how it plays out. And discussing this relationship between language and culture and all of these smaller sociopragmatic choices that we make. That's where my brain goes. As far as like how to make a place less transphobic, wow, that's the question, right? If I had the answer, I'd be waving my magic wand around the whole world and getting rid of turfdom and cissexism, and the whole world would be lovely for everyone. I think resisting it and pointing out all of these moments as they're happening where it's not logical and it's not just, and trying to slowly but surely move the needle. That's the best I have on that front.
Awesome. And I think on that note, we will wrap it up here. Kris, thank you again for all the suggestions, all the resources, everything you've shared with us. This was a very timely topic, and I think we all have a lot to mull over and see how we can implement some of the wonderful suggestions that you have for us. So thank you, Kris, for this amazing talk today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for doing something, whatever it might be. And yeah, be in conversation if I can be of help,
Exactly.
support, or otherwise.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And we look forward to seeing you at the March event. Thank you.